Who are a few of the worst and most despicable criminals around? Let's find out. Starting with number 6, the Complete Psychopath. Bricen Rivers was arrested after his girlfriend, Lauren Johansen's body was found wrapped in a sheet in the back of her vehicle. The car was found in a cemetery, and at the point of the discovery, the police saw Rivers running into the woods. He was later apprehended after a 6-hour manhunt. This was a crime that should have never happened. Well, we suppose that's true for most crimes, but definitely this crime as well. Rivers had already been arrested back in December of 2023 for going after Lauren while he was on vacation with her. Apparently, he had driven her around for a while before stopping in a parking lot and started hurting her for about an hour. We're not sure exactly what was going on or why, but thankfully the police intervened just as Rivers was reaching for a weapon. As a result, Rivers was charged with 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping and 1 count of coercion of a witness. It seems like they should have charged him with more though, doesn't it? Rivers was held on a $250,000 bond and stayed in jail for around 7 months. Things got dicey when his bail was reduced by $100,000 and he could afford to get out. Instead of spending time with his family and setting his affairs in order before his trial, Rivers decided to go hunting for Lauren. At the time of Rivers' release, Lauren, who was studying to become a nurse, was living with her sister, thinking she would have been safe there. One of the conditions of Rivers' release was that he'd wear an ankle monitor, which offered Lauren further protection since someone would be keeping an eye on him. But he never showed up to get the monitor put on, and the police quickly realized that that wasn't a good sign. So they got a hold of Lauren's dad and warned him that Rivers never showed up. Tragically, the warning was too late. That night, Lauren's sister woke up to find her door open, her sister missing, and her security cameras smashed. It was immediately obvious what happened. On the other side of town, Lauren's father got an alert on his phone that Lauren's location tracking app had been turned off. So understandably, everyone panicked, called the cops. The police eventually tracked Lauren's vehicle down to a cemetery and found that a horrific tragedy had already occurred. The details are pretty grisly, so we're not going to talk about them here, but it was pretty bad. One of the saddest things about this case is that everyone but the judge who reduced Rivers' bond could see it coming. Rivers was actually going around saying that if he ever got out, he would try to hurt Lauren. So we're not exactly sure what else would have needed to be said. Despite that, Rivers was released and given enough freedom that he could choose not to report to the station to get his ankle monitor. Of course, Lauren's dad blames the criminal justice system for his daughter's passing, and from our point of view, it doesn't sound like he's wrong. How much more warning did the courts need to see that Rivers was clearly a threat? Number 5, the Career Shoplifter. Jeanette Fidler made a career out of stealing and has finally been stopped after her 250th offense. The funny thing is that this came after she gave a moving speech to the House of Lords, the UK's version of the Senate, about her 26-year-long career in crime. Everyone thought that Jeanette had retired for good, which is silly, because just 9 weeks after giving the speech, she was arrested after going on 2 more crime sprees. Before going on this particular spree, Fidler already had 248 offenses on her record. Apparently, that wasn't enough for 56-year-old Jeanette, who must have wanted to round up those offenses to a nice-looking number like 250. The mother of 3 began her latest one-woman crime wave by grabbing about 135 pounds worth of stuff from Costco. After that, she went to another Costco and stole a PlayStation steering wheel and 2 backbone controllers worth around 178 pounds, which means she stole roughly 313 pounds worth of stuff in 2 incidents. But according to Jeanette, it was all for a good cause. So, no worries. When interrogated, she claimed that she had stolen the items to replace her kids' controllers, which were stolen in a burglary. Obviously, since double negatives make a positive, every place else it should translate to crime, right? Unfortunately for Jeanette and her lawyers, this argument just didn't fly. Apparently, you can't just steal items because yours were stolen, and double negatives only work in math and English. Even if Jeanette claimed that her thefts were done for totally altruistic reasons, she has a history of crime that suggests that petty theft might be more of a lifestyle choice. If stealing were a career, Jeanette would be a veteran by now. Her years of experience are probably unmatched, and she has been called one of Britain's most prolific thieves. Her career began back in 1998 after she was let go from her job as a manager for a recruitment company. That was when she got hooked on a substance that some people call the Big H, or brown sugar. Once she was hooked, she got into a lot of debt. So, to pay off her debts, she decided to prey on the users of swimming baths and gyms. She would often steal keys, money, and other valuables from the bags of users who were distracted by their kids or other people. One victim lost her engagement ring, and on another occasion, she broke into 5 lockers. Jeanette quickly became prolific, and at one point, she was all over the north of England stealing goods worth tens of thousands of pounds. And what did she use all of that money for? To get even more brown sugar, obviously. Because why not? Baker's gonna bake. At some point, Fidler was banned by almost every gym, pool, or leisure spot in the area. Everyone knew about her kleptomania, and they wanted nothing to do with her. She has been arrested and jailed multiple times, but she would always get released and go back to doing the same thing. One time, she was jailed for 3 years after 32 offenses, and another time she was imprisoned for another 2 years for at least 65 offenses. She was even banned from entering hotels and other leisure spots for 4 years by a judge. But did that stop our enterprising thief? No, it didn't. Fidler went to prison 4 more times after that. This most recent offense would make it her 7th run-in with the law. As of the release of this video, she has been sentenced to a 12-month community order with requirements that she undertakes 100 hours of unpaid work. She also has to attend 15 days of rehabilitative activity with the probation service. Hopefully, she cleans up her act with this, but honestly, we doubt it. Number 4, the Scummy Landscaper. Michael Gorman took advantage of a now late pensioner, Roy Wilcox, by overcharging him by nearly £50,000 for landscaping jobs. Gorman, who was running a failing landscaping business, thought that the best way to save his business was by defrauding a senior who didn't know any better. Gorman didn't waste any time in defrauding his victim. After their first contact in November of 2021, Wilcox told Gorman that he simply wanted to have the concrete paving of his garden done. So Gorman charged him over £12,000, which was way overpriced since the job should have only cost about £4,000. Then, after doing that job and overcharging the victim by more than £8,000, Wilcox wanted to install some AstroTurf. This installation should have only cost around £2,000, and we know this because the police managed to get a hold of Gorman's notebook where he actually kept records of how much he should have charged. But of course, Gorman never communicated this to the client and instead charged £42,000. So he overcharged Wilcox £40,000, which is insane. Just for some perspective, the average annual earning in the UK is around £35,000. Sadly, Wilcox didn't know any better, so after some grumbling, he paid the fee, and Gorman pocketed an annual wage for a job that cost a tiny fraction of what he was charging. After Wilcox paid that ridiculous amount for the installation of artificial grass, his bank actually stepped up and intervened, stopping the payment. Definitely have to commend the bank on that one. The payment stoppage raised some red flags, leading to further investigation by the police. During the investigation, evidence of Gorman's shady business practices were revealed, including his records and the discrepancy in charges, which led to his arrest and prosecution. By the time Gorman had his day in court, Roy Wilcox had sadly already passed on. Thankfully, he provided a victim statement before he passed, and that statement clarified that he only paid that amount because he trusted Gorman. He had no way of knowing Gorman was a fraudster who didn't have any issues ripping off a pensioner. The good news is that Gorman didn't get away with it and got himself 32 months in prison. It seems obvious, but it's always good practice to get multiple quotes on any jobs you may want to hire out. Not only will you be ensuring that you're getting a good deal, but it'll prevent anything like this from happening. Number 3, the Terrible Caregiver. Anna Bullinger stole over $1 million from the 94-year-old woman she was taking care of, Peggy Nardone. And Bullinger would have gotten away with it if she hadn't made a typically greedy mistake. The gig was pretty sweet for thieving Anna Bullinger. She had a sweet patient in Nardone that she took care of every day, and since this patient was frail, Bullinger also took advantage of Nardone by writing out checks with her victim's signature to herself. She started with amounts that were large enough to add up, but small enough that her victim didn't quickly notice. Then Anna made a big mistake. The day after her patient passed away, Bullinger made out a $90,000 check to her daughter's account and labeled it as a gift to avoid suspicion. Like, who doesn't know that 94-year-old patients who have already passed away often write checks for large amounts of money as gifts to the daughters of their caretakers? It sounds totally normal, doesn't it? Nothing to see here. But greedy Anna didn't stop at that massive check. Why would she? She was on a roll. parole. So she also took her victim's late husband's trust worth $650,000 and also put it into her own daughter's account as a gift. Once Nardone passed away, her estate attorney went through her finances and saw the big check, so they called the authorities. The police quickly launched an investigation and finally revealed just how much Anna had stolen. By the time they tallied up the 140 fraudulent checks, she was figured to have stolen roughly $1.1 million. As of the release of this video, Anna Bullinger has been charged with one felony count of exploitation of the elderly over $50,000 and was released on a $50,000 bond. Stories like this always serve as a good reminder to keep in contact with your elderly loved ones. As scams are becoming more and more common, our most vulnerable are becoming preferred targets, and the people who care about them are really their only defense. Number 2. Mayhem on two wheels. In Harlem, 97-year-old resident Thelma Mason was knocked to the ground by an unnamed mugger on a moped. The thief rode up to Mason, yanked off her 18-karat gold necklace, and sped away on a black moped, leaving her injured and shaken. Mason, who was taken to Harlem Hospital, thankfully suffered only minor injuries and was in stable condition. The police are still searching for the mugger as of the release of this video. He was seen wearing all black except for white sneakers with black stripes. Sadly, this type of robbery is part of a growing trend in the area.
On scooters, given the 80-plus scooter robberies we told you about just last week,
where scooters and mopeds are increasingly used in serious crimes. And we thought just being seen on those was already enough of a crime. Seriously, it's impossible to look tough on one of those things. At least the NYPD is still actively fighting back, seizing 39 of these two-wheelers and issuing numerous summonses. Statistics show a significant rise in crimes involving scooters, mopeds, and motorcycles this year compared to the same period in 2023. Mason shared her harrowing experience. She described the thief as a lowlife and expressed her desire for him to be locked up for 20 years. The mugging has left her anxious, particularly around motorbikes. She now fears being targeted again whenever she's out. Thelma was on her way home from the store when she noticed the man on a motorbike at a bus stop. He eyed her, and as she continued walking, he approached and snatched the necklace from her neck. The force of the robbery caused her to fall, leaving her with a nasty scratch on her arm and a hurt hip. An eyewitness said that the mugger was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He waited for the right moment to strike and quickly took off with the 18-karat gold necklace, which had a Gemini twins pendant, a cherished gift from Thelma's daughter. Thelma, a Harlem resident since 1951, reminisced about how the neighborhood has changed. She used to enjoy late nights out without fear, but now even daytime outings feel dangerous. The thief and the stolen necklace remain unaccounted for, and the police continue their search for the culprit, but we all know that it's not likely he'll ever get caught. The sad thing about this is that Thelma's 97 and still going out, which in our opinion is quite incredible. And now this guy took that bit of freedom away from her at the end of her life over an 18-karat gold necklace? Not for nothing, but the sentimental value of that necklace and Thelma's independence were likely worth far more than the actual value of the necklace. Thelma seems pretty tough though, so we think she'll be alright. If you're enjoying this video, be sure to stay tuned right here to find out just how far she was willing to go to play a fake doctor. Number 1. Caught right on camera. Grisella Avetti stole 130 pounds from an elderly patient with dementia and stuck the money in her bra on camera. Avetti was supposed to be looking after a patient in her 90s, but she decided to look after the woman's cash instead. The incredible thing was that Avetti would have never been caught if not for a tragic incident that happened at the victim's home days earlier. 20,000 pounds worth of jewelry had been stolen from the house days earlier, which prompted the residents to install motion sensor cameras in the rooms. Of course, Avetti didn't know about this, so she went about her business like she normally did. Too bad that part of that business was stealing from helpless victims. On the day of the theft, the victim's daughter had to be away for the night, so Avetti was around with the victim alone for the entire night. And on that particular evening, Avetti walked into the victim's room and started going through her drawers and taking money. She then stuffed that money in her bra to avoid detection, like the classy lady she is. Fortunately, the camera caught all of it. The police were called, and Avetti was arrested. During her court appearance, the judge refused to send her to jail despite finding her guilty. Instead, she was given a 12-month community order, 160 hours unpaid work, and ordered to pay 750 pounds costs and an 85-pound victim surcharge. Here's a story about saving a girl from the blog of Renee Back, an American missionary in Uganda attempting to save a child, quote, I hooked the baby up to oxygen and got to work. As I took her temperature, started an IV, checked her blood sugar, tested for malaria, and looked at her HB count, I was attempting to diagnose the many problems that could potentially be at hand. After doing a search for blood around Gingertown, we found her type, and it was a match. We started the transfusion. The only problem is the fact that Renee Bach is not a doctor. Renee Bach isn't even a nurse. Renee Bach has no actual medical training whatsoever. She's self-taught, and her missionary center, serving his children, known locally as SHC, has been accused of being responsible for the demise of hundreds of kids. Bach often wore a lab coat and stethoscope, was known to offer diagnosis, administer IVs, and write prescriptions. A volunteer claimed to be driving 7 to 10 children who had passed away back to their families each week. Before all of the trouble with SHC and the lawsuits, Renee Bach was an average Christian teenager who lived in a small town in Virginia. She'd planned to get married, have 5 kids, and lead a very simple life. However, after she got her high school diploma, members of her church told her that an orphanage in Jinja, Uganda needed volunteers. Bach took the opportunity and volunteered in Uganda for 9 months. She immediately fell in love with the place and said that she felt at peace there. When she returned to America, she had an urging in her spirit to go back to Uganda. According to Bach, it was almost like a supernatural experience, like God was calling her back to Uganda. Bach started a feeding program since so many people are hungry in Africa. She raised money through her church and started a free lunch program. The program was held 2 days per week, and Bach hired people to sort out the arrangements for cooking and cleaning. By the end of her first year, Bach was feeding thousands of people. Her program was a success, and Bach quickly became popular among the locals. Things were going great, but Renee wasn't completely satisfied. One day, Bach received a call from the local hospital. The hospital had some stable but malnourished kids that needed refeeding, and they believed that SHC could help. So Bach took the kids in and started feeding them. That was when she discovered exactly how endemic the problem of malnourishment was in Uganda. The free lunch program wasn't just enough, and Bach got the idea to provide more holistic support to the children and their parents. She believed that she could care for malnourished kids, hire nutritionists to educate their parents, and have their parents help out in the community garden as a form of payment. That way, she would be solving a present problem, preventing a future one from reoccurring, and also getting help in terms of labor from parents of sick children. Bach thought it was a brilliant plan and wrote about it in her blog. The response from locals to Bach's program was tremendous. She soon started getting referrals from hospitals far away. These hospitals realized that Bach had time and resources they didn't have, so they referred cases to her by the dozen. Bach was doing what God had called her to do, at least in her mind. Bach decided to make everything official and named the center Serving His Children, locally referred to as SHC. The center was registered with the Ugandan government and got a certificate that allowed it to carry out its activities in evangelism and providing care. Bach also ramped up hiring. She brought in nurses, nutritionists, and even doctors. But despite hiring medical staff, Bach failed to get SHC a medical license for the first 4 years. In her defense, she claimed that everyone who came to the center signed a waiver acknowledging that the center was not a hospital. But the forms were in English, and many of the people who came to her center were illiterate. But it's just malnutrition, so no big deal, right? It seems like malnutrition should be an easy health problem to solve. Someone is starving, you give them food, they get better. But treating malnourished children isn't merely a matter of providing food. When the body is in a state of severe malnutrition, it starts to consume itself to survive. This means that intracellular enzymes stop functioning properly, and so do major organs. When nutrients are introduced to the body at that point, there can be a huge shift in electrolytes that could cause a potentially deadly condition called refeeding syndrome. In proper conditions, doctors monitor the electrolyte levels in patients and adjust treatment accordingly while feeding them. But Bach's center couldn't afford this level of care, so they just went on providing treatment, unworried about the consequences. The work soon got overwhelming for Bach as the number of her patients increased. She couldn't keep proper records and had no help from the hospitals around. At the same time, Bach just couldn't turn away those in need. She'd been called involved, and she was saving lives. It was a recipe for disaster. The volume of work SHC was tasked with required Bach to ask for volunteers, and she got them. One of those volunteers was Jacqueline Kramlich, a nurse who volunteered at SHC in 2011. As it happens, Kramlich became a very important character in the drama that befell the SHC in its last days. In the suit against Bach, Kramlich was one of the few volunteers who could provide a direct account. Kramlich was fresh out of nursing school, offered her services, but said Bach didn't seem to want any help. She rebuffed any relevant questions about the medicine she was administering and brushed Kramlich off at every step. Kramlich further claimed she once saw Bach attempt to treat patients who showed symptoms of serious ailments. She said she saw Bach carry out procedures without medical oversight from doctors, things that required significant training. Kramlich further claimed that Bach rarely followed universal precautions and guidelines, such as wearing gloves or washing hands while treating patients. Bach often said that Ugandan doctors had no idea what they were talking about. She felt that she was smarter than them because she had access to online resources. She must have assumed that doctors in Uganda didn't have access to Google or only their silly medical degrees. Kramlich also claimed that she saw Bach give a child with anemia a bottle of intravenous iron just to see what would happen. In the end, Kramlich decided that she'd seen enough and soon sent in her resignation. In her letter, she wrote that Bach was motivated and committed, but had no medical training and wasn't qualified to administer any treatment. She wrote that it was irresponsible for someone like Bach to be supervising a center like SHC. Finally, she said that she quit because the entire environment was simply too unethical for her to remain. Kramlich moved back to the US in 2015 and might have forgotten the entire issue if she'd not confided in her friend Kelsey Nielsen, an American social worker. Nielsen started the influential media program No White Saviors just 3 years later. No White Saviors would eventually become the campaign that blew the lid off Bach's entire operation. No White Saviors, or NSW, was an NGO, or non-governmental organization, started by Kelsey Nielsen and a Ugandan social worker. The goal of the NGO was to fight against white missionaries who came to Africa in a bid to help, but ended up making things worse. Or at least that was what this NGO claimed to do. Right off the bat, Bach was NWS's primary target. Nielsen believed that Bach had done a lot of harm and got it in her mind to make sure she paid for it. Nielsen had actually worked as a volunteer in the same town as SHC, so she was familiar with Bach. In fact, in a blog post, she argued that she initially admired Bach and wanted to be like her. At the same time, she said she felt a little envious of Bach's status. However, Nielsen quickly became disillusioned about the quality of care Bach was offering to the children she treated. One kid had passed of a heart attack when he was in care of the center Nielsen worked at. Before coming to Nielsen Center, the child had been severely malnourished. The child was then referred to SHC, where Bach and her staff did all they could to nurse the child back to health. Once the child was healthy again, he was sent on his way. However, he soon became malnourished again. This time, he was sent to Nielsen Center, where he eventually passed of a heart attack. This case bothered Nielsen so much because she believed that Bach was partly at fault. She claimed that assuming SHC had followed up on the case, the child wouldn't have deteriorated. After that case, Nielsen started to look more critically at the patients Bach was dealing with, and what she found horrified her. Nielsen discovered that Bach loved hands-on medical care and wasn't a stranger to treating children. She also claimed that Bach often went to hospitals to get babies so that she could treat them. For her part, Bach said she discovered that a boy that SHC had treated was staying at Nielsen's charity organization. She got in touch with Nielsen and offered to send over the boy's medical records, but Nielsen failed to follow up. As the boy got sicker, he was diagnosed with heart problems. Nielsen started raising money online for him, but Bach got in touch and said SHC would cover the costs of his treatment. Bach said that she met Nielsen in person and handed over the money for treatment. According to Bach, Nielsen was somewhat cold after collecting the money. In the meantime, Nielsen announced that she'd met with a cardiologist and that the boy had been cured. That night, the child passed. Bach claims that since then, Nielsen has blamed her. When they got together to talk the matter out, Nielsen claimed that if the child had never been to SHC, he would still have been alive. For Nielsen, the reason was simple. If SHC had done longer follow-up care, they would have caught that the boy was getting worse. However, Bach claimed that SHC simply didn't have the resources for that sort of long-term follow-up work, and the drive to the boys' house from SHC was about 8 hours. To Bach, it was unreasonable to expect that level of follow-up care from SHC. Nielsen, on the other hand, believed it was necessary. She argued that SHC needed to hire more workers and provide longer care. So, that's exactly what Bach did. A week later, she hired an extra worker and increased aftercare from 3 months to 6 months. But that wasn't enough. While Cromlech claimed that she saw Bach setting IV lines, she eventually conceded that it wasn't anything serious. IV lines were easy to set, and Bach was quite good at doing them. However, she maintained that Bach was still doing some dangerous medical procedures. Cromlech further argued that she didn't realize how bad the situation was at SHC until she left. A nurse over at SHC had told her that Bach performed a major surgery that involves cutting the chest open. This claim, too, was eventually walked back. The nurse Cromlech claims to have heard the story from quickly filed an affidavit in Bach's defense. She claimed that she'd never said anything of that nature to Cromlech. But Cromlech and Nielsen weren't the only ones who had interesting stories to tell about Bach. Samai Jolly Kabanakola worked as an agriculturalist at SHC for around 8 years. Samai said that during his time at the center, he discovered that Bach often encouraged mothers to leave hospitals and bring their children to SHC. Samai also said he assumed that Bach was a health worker because he'd seen her regularly wearing a clinical coat and a stethoscope. He also said that he'd seen her treating children daily. In response to Samai's claim, Bach argued that she'd never worn a clinical coat or misrepresented herself as a doctor. She also said that as an agriculturalist, Samai had limited access to the patients and workers at the center, so he could never have heard her encouraging mothers to do anything. Another volunteer, Charles Olweni, said that he'd worked as a gatekeeper at the program for 8 years. He said that Bach would often take blood, offer diagnosis, administer IVs, and write prescriptions. He also said he saw a lot of children pass, and that he often had to deliver the kids back to their families himself. But even those claims didn't hold up. According to Bach's records, the center treated over 1,000 kids and only about 119 children passed. It would be unlikely for Charles to have delivered 10 kids to their villages every week. Bach also said that Charles was dishonest, and the only reason he testified was because he'd been sacked. Unfortunately for Bach, her defenses couldn't save her when Cromlech eventually decided to report SHC to the Ugandan authorities. The district health officer promptly arrived at the center and shut it down because its operating license was no longer valid. The shutdown was an unmitigated disaster. The district officer only gave SHC 4 hours to move patients out of the center. This meant that Bach had to move children who were still on oxygen and others who were seriously ill. She complained to the officers that the kids could pass away, and he told her that was none of his business. 8 of those children passed away within 3 days. Then came the lawsuits. When it rains, it pours, and Bach's forecast was dark and stormy. The Women's Pro Bono Initiative eventually got a whiff of the accusations Bach was dealing with. In time, they found 2 cases they could use to file a lawsuit against her. The 2 lawsuits were on behalf of mothers who claimed that their children passed as a result of Bach's negligence. The lawsuit made strong claims about the culpability of Bach and SHC, but those claims also fell apart under scrutiny. The first case was about a young child named Tuwali Kafabi. Kafabi passed away at SHC after a few days of receiving treatment. Kafabi's grandmother blamed Bach since she was pretending to be a doctor. But the evidence suggests that Kafabi was seriously ill, and SHC had done all it could to help treat him. When he was presented at the center, he was attended to by a doctor 4 times. Unfortunately, his case deteriorated. Independent experts were given the boy's case file to review, and not one of them could point out a misstep by SHC. According to the experts, SHC gave the child proper care, but his case was simply too far gone. Additionally, the sort of care that could have saved the child was probably not available in the area at that time. According to Kafabi's grandmother, she routinely saw Bach trying to treat her grandson. However, at the time the child was admitted, Bach was on her way to the United States and remained there for the duration of his stay. The stamps on her passport proved it. The second story was even more inconclusive. It was about Elijah, the child of Annette Kakia. According to Kakai, her son Elijah had been diagnosed with tuberculosis. An SHC driver had taken her and her son to a hospital where SHC was running a program in partnership with the Ugandan government. At the health center, Kakai was informed that her son couldn't be admitted because they had no isolated wards. However, she was offered some milk for him and given transportation money home. But Elijah didn't get better after drinking the milk, and Kakai had to take him to another hospital. He passed away at the hospital 3 days later. Kakai claimed that her son had received tainted milk from SHC, but that's impossible to prove. It's possible he did receive tainted milk, but it's more likely that tuberculosis had killed him. In Bach's defense in court, she claimed that Elijah was never even admitted to SHC. She argued that SHC couldn't be held responsible for what happened to a child who was never under their care. Despite the very heavy accusations targeted at SHC, Ugandan government officials were convinced that the center was a net positive. Officials of the area, SHC, wrote a letter of recommendation allowing SHC to renew its license. However, the government didn't turn a blind eye to the accusations and lawsuits against SHC. The Ugandan government launched its own inquiry after learning about the lawsuits, and the Uganda Medical and Dental Practitioners Council looked extensively into the matter. The investigators finished their investigations and found no evidence to support the claim that SHC caused the demise of a large number of children. Despite the many accusations coming from locals and volunteers, not everyone disliked Bach and SHC. The head of a local hospital, Abner Tegula, argued that Bach was simply trying to fill a gap that the government couldn't fill. In the end, he said that if he had the offer to work with Bach again, he would take it without a second thought. Another local supporter of Bach is the district health officer of the area, Gideon Wamasep. Aside from being the district health officer, he also worked with Bach to establish a feeding program. According to Gideon, all accusations that Bach treated patients were false. He said that he was the one who often saw patients, and Bach was the one who paid. All she wanted was to get good doctors who could work with her and deliver quality health care to patients. Gideon argued that Bach never had any interest in treating patients, nor did she attempt to. He said that the claim about thousands of kids passing at SHC was simply impossible. There couldn't be that many children in the district passing without causing an uproar. Investigations revealed that all wasn't quite right with Bach's accusers either. One of her biggest accusers, Semei Jolly Kwenbankola, the agriculturalist, proved himself to be a self-serving person who just wanted to shake Bach down. In an interview with a journalist, he revealed that one of his primary issues with Bach was that she fired him after he asked for a salary increase. Additionally, he was pushing for an out-of-court settlement with Bach, and it appeared that was all he was in the case for. He just wanted a slice of the money coming into SHC from donors. For doctors, malnutrition in children is one of the trickiest conditions to treat. In many cases, it's probably better to do nothing than to do something and possibly make matters worse. Children suffering from malnutrition are so fragile that something as basic as hydrating the child through an IV could trigger unfavorable reactions. This risk is the reason why Ugandan authorities only approve malnourishment treatment to be undertaken by high-level facilities and not just health centers. So it's possible that SHC may have been making matters worse. While Bach agrees that she might have made some mistakes, she insists that in many cases she had no choice. She often took the malnourished children to hospitals and they would turn her away, saying they didn't have the resources to give proper care. Bach recognized the situation, but she couldn't just hand the kids back to their parents and send them on their way. In her mind, some action was better than no action. Investigations into SHC revealed that the center had a mortality rate that was around 20% at one point. It eventually reduced that number to around 10%. According to experts at UNICEF, fatality rates that high were bad enough to raise certain red flags. In the end, Bach decided to settle the case out of court. SHC gave the two mothers $9,500 each and admitted no guilt in the case. While that may have been the end for that case, it doesn't mean it's the end of legal troubles for Bach. The No White Saviors advocacy group that had been set up by Nielsen has promised to get in contact with even more mothers who could sue SHC. This could mean another round of legal battles and settlements for Bach, and who knows what the courts will decide this time. In the meantime, Bach was forced to flee back to the US due to the number of death threats she was receiving. Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comments section what you'd rather have: free gas for life or free health insurance for life.